Could you
Hello.
please share your presentation?
Sure, yes. Okay, just sharing screen now. Thank you very much. Okay, can you see the screen okay?
Yes, but please see your
Oh, yes.
yeah, our screen.
Hang on.
Yes, yes, copy screen. Yes.
Just a
Press the
moment.
display setting
Yes.
and the upper side, right? Then the copy screen. That would be.
How's it now?
Oh, good, perfect.
Good.
Okay, thank you. So yes, okay. So obviously a few things I'll say should complement some of the things we've been hearing so far. Though I'll just to answer the types of questions that were posed at the beginning. The short answers, I suppose, for me would be, well, yes, we can distinguish between the two. I would also argue that it's useful to do that. And thirdly, I'll say that recognizing the integration between the two areas, risk management and emergency management, has got some useful sort of research fronts, and that will be important for the IDRiM Society. So what I'm going to present then is predominantly ways of interpreting the differences between risk management and emergency management. I'll say something about the processes of change that influence this distinction. Okay, and these processes of change usually to do with policy and practice. Thirdly, why it matters to recognize the difference. And if time, I've just got one slide which will say something about the UK system of emergency and risk management as it currently looks from what I can see. And then lastly, just a few points on this, the implications for research and the society. So getting on with the first part of this then, as you probably, those who know me will recognize, I sort of come from a geographical sort of background, but also very much focused on intersecting development and disaster issues. So this is just another way, really, of the diagram I'm referring to now is just another way of interpreting what people have already been referring to today. The language slightly different. I would say a sort of developmental approach is one way of looking at sort of everyday life as sort of opposed to a more emergency mode of operation. And you can map the disaster management cycle within that, and you end up with those elements which are more to do with prevention and those which are more to do with response. But what I've done here is list 5 ways of interpreting differences between risk management and emergency management. The first of these being probability. So probability being on the risk side of the equation, the risk based on the likelihood and the impact. And you know, on the risk side of the equation, there are many ways of looking at risk, hazard and vulnerability, offset by capacity, through to again the offsetting of risk by sustainability, and many more notions of risk. But the most frequent one being the sort of measurable approach. These are all explanatory sort of approaches. Whereas with emergency, we're often dealing with something which has already happened. So the scope changes there. So another way of looking at this then on the second bullet would be prevention and response. And on this one, on the prevention side, there's risk management, and on the response side, more emergency management. I think that point's been made pretty clearly today. Time, I would say a little bit more about that. I think I'd certainly agree that risk has no time in essence. But on the emergency side, we could point to how time is often speeded up, but it depends how you want to represent emergency, long-term type of emergencies or chronic emergencies, as opposed to acute, rapid onset type of emergencies. But this would be another way of differentiating power. So if you if we take the risk side of the management equation here, then you see the evolution of an all of society type of approach versus on the emergency side, a very much more structured, often top-down, even militaristic type of approach. So, there are ways of interpreting the differences along that axis of power and control and decision making. And finally, culture, one which is often, sort of people are aware of, but perhaps not taken into an operational environment so much. If we can say on the risk side of the equation, the risk behavior and the way that is a function of personality of individuals, faith, hope, and so forth, all would come within that, versus the emergency management sort of group of phenomena, which would be often more tending towards a more standardized type of reactions, because ultimately in emergency management, there's a sort of lot of pressure for controllability. Okay, so those are just some ideas on that. Now, on the processes that influence in the characteristics of risk and emergency management in practice, then, if we say, well, the basis is going to be quite inclusive in this sort of way, an integrated, comprehensive type of approach, then we can recognize knowledge, power, and culture as being fundamental. Now, there's also environment as well. I've not put that in today because there's such a lot on hazards and the environmental sort of uncertainties as well. And that's all relevant too. But here I put the emphasis here because we're trying to tease out the difference between different forms of management approach. So knowledge for engaging risk and emergency would be a basis. The power, constraints, and enablers of being able to engage risk and emergency culture is going to involve people choosing and what's influencing their choices in terms of their beliefs and understandings and personalities that I referred to earlier. So that could be the sort of basis for trying to understand where these different processes are coming from. And then I've got a few examples down there. And these, I suppose, link now to policy and practice reasonably well, in that we have decision-making in context of uncertainty. And if it's a risk-orientated culture one is working with, then this will recognize all the peculiarity of influences on decision-making that people have. For example, the influence of fake information or uncorroborated views about things which have no scientific basis whatsoever would be just one example. Building up early as well as building back better. These are processes that we're hearing about around the world in different strategies. At least the building back better one, which is very popular just now. It's part of the Sendai framework. But what about building up earlier? So that's a different cultural sort of approach. So building up early would be more akin to the risks sort of emphasis, whereas building back better, a little bit more recovery and management. These things are not separable, but there are different nuances involved. Approximating more distant responsibilities would be another thing to consider. So in risk, the risk of deprivation of future societies is very long-term, and with the immediate responsibility to respond to a collapsing building brings out a different type of sense of responsibility. And very often the more distant and to do with long-term sustainability, the more people are less engaged, though there are distinct initiatives to try and do something about that. And then distinguishing about who decides, where power resides. So this links to my list on the previous slide in many ways. And then enabling values and hope, the sort of cultural determinants and influences are going to be there. I did sort of have a go at this a long time ago, actually trying to sort of see what the influences on risk management processes would be. And the question today is, what's the difference between this and emergency management? So in looking at this again, I would say, well, certainly we've still got all these examples of influences on the process. These are the words around the outside of the diagram, and it's not all of them, but it's some of the things that influence risk assessment, your perception, the ability to be able to measure risk, and so forth. And right the way around, you'll see that these are the influences on this risk management process. So thinking, well, what's the difference with emergency management? Well, you could say in brief, I would say probably it's that this whole thing is speeded up. This starts to speed up, and decisions are made quicker. There may be some evidence that there's greater learning in emergencies because everything happens quicker, but not necessarily. So it speeds up. There's the third point, I think, is that where the changes occur will vary in between emergency management and a more risk-orientated approach. And the fourth point I'd have to say would be that if we actually took out the word risk within this diagram and put emergency, it would still work, i.e. backing up the points made at the very opening of the seminar today that they are often quite similarly used. And so you could put emergency into this just by changing the wording a bit, and it would still be very relevant. So, but then I think you would be looking at, in the real world, a different set of processes and influences, so that conceptually this type of cyclical process still would function, whether you call it emergency management or risk management. So that's probably quite useful for the crossover. Right, why it matters to recognize the difference then. So why all that sort of looking at the nuances and separating them out? Well, intellectually, of course, interesting, but beyond that, these are actually, I would argue, more than just that. First of all, we can say that disasters need not be inevitable because we can do prevention. But if we went sort of idealistically just down risk assessment and risk management and say, well, all disasters are avoidable, this may be true theoretically, but in reality, we'll know, well, that's never really going to be the case. So they are inevitable as well. So this is why the sort of risk management or risk assessment sort of culture needs to be balanced with the reality of response. Okay, we can come back to that later if it's not clear. Complex disaster causes and outcomes demand both aspects, as we've seen earlier. So I think that point should already clearly made. But on the third one here, I would also argue that there are different institutions involved in risk assessment, risk management, and another set of institutions often involved in emergency management. So I think it's important that we recognize these are two entry points to prevention and response, the modus operandi, a particular way or method. And in terms of engaging more people into the equation, then it's good to recognize the difference, just in terms of who goes around saying, oh, I'm involved in emergency management versus someone who says I'm involved in disaster risk reduction. If you see what I mean, it's sometimes these are different communities, not always. They're more integrated than they used to be, I think. But that can be a way of reaching more people or engaging more people, and that's got to be a good thing for disaster risk reduction and response. So this is a bit detailed, and you have the slides to refer back to later made available. So perhaps I need to watch my time here. I'll not go into great detail on this, but just the key point about looking at any one system in any part of the world, and I've chosen the UK system here because that's where I'm based. I think we can say quite clearly up until about 2000, we were looking at this very sort of more militaristic sort of conception of emergency management, risk mainly about quantifying likelihood and impact, and the military being involved if something was very large. And we started to move in this. In 2001, you get the Civil Contingency Secretariat trying to look for a more coordinated and joined up approach to disaster management or emergency management. And then the structure of this evolved somewhat so that you would involve local agencies much more, and giving much more responsibility to police, fire and rescue, and first responders of one sort or the other. There's still a command and control system, this sort of top-down approach, with bronze being operational, silver tactical, and gold strategic. And this is run through the Cabinet Office. What happened was this became very challenged by the emergence of more risk-orientated frameworks, leading to ultimately other approaches like the National Framework for Community Resilience. So UK resilience is now also embedded within Cabinet Office, and they're trying to find ways of marrying these two things up. It's work in process even now, years later. So in summary, I think what we've got is this going on in a number of countries and places and systems. This sort of more integrated approach is known about, and efforts are being tried to made to marry them up. The observations would be on this that major changes in policy orientations are happening more quickly. I think they're more universal, and so you get a sort of standardization or homogenization of ideas in different places. And in this sector, that might not be such a bad thing. And but everywhere, I think there needs to be more radical investment in prevention. And this would be the case in the UK. This would be the case in other places I'm aware of. My last slide is really just to say that there are key points about researching risk and emergency management that we can build on with this. And the IDRiM Society, for example, would be very good to continue working in this sort of way. Integrating things is quite a powerful approach. The aim for it is improved planetary well-being. Ultimately, risk and emergency management driven research can do that. I think we've got to encourage innovation through exploratory research, and be quite risky about our research, and see where we come up with sort of new ideas always, hopefully, to take this forward. Inclusive approaches is essential, and that means embracing emergency management community as much as it does the risk community, indeed, if these are distinct communities. And I would extend that to other parts of response, such as the humanitarian sector, for example. Improved communication and integrated risk emergency management is something a group like this or society is already doing. And just by putting on this type of chat today, it's contributing significantly in that sort of way, and all the other events like it that come through the IDRiM Society. So thank you very much. Finish.